This is the Chapter 8, Segment 2 outline, and going back a little bit to offer context to where this segment picked up, the first section we talk about is taste aversion, prove the relevance of evolution to conditioning. So, some background information. A conditioned taste aversion is a acquired repulsion to a taste or flavor that was previously followed by nausea. So this is pretty common. Sometimes people will eat something, it may make them sick, or the food itself may have nothing to do as to why they throw up or they experience nausea. But after the fact, since that event was followed by nausea, there is now an association with that feeling in the food, so they may feel a repulsion to a certain taste or flavor. And this is all about, this is often seen a lot in nature. So one example the book gives is a blue jay that eats a monarch butterfly, so soon becomes ill and will therefore avoid eating other such butterflies. And another example that the text gives is scientists advocated using conditioned taste aversions to control coyote populations that encroach on farmers. So they had laced sheep meat with chemicals and left it out for wild coyotes to consume, and the coyotes got ill after eating tainted meat, and so coyote predation on sheep flocks plummeted. And this is a type of learning, as we can see. And so conditioned taste aversion experiments represent one of the earliest demonstrations that natural selection shapes how well animals can learn various tasks. Later research revealed other types of adaptive learning in animals. For example, imprinting. It's the behavior by which birds are predisposed to follow any moving object that they see shortly after hatching. And this is a tendency to recognize and bond with literally the first moving object they see and to follow it. And if the object is a man, they will follow him. Normally, of course, the first moving object is their mother, so it is very adaptive for chicks to learn to recognize and follow her. And this is just another observation that some behaviors are more easily learned by a certain species, so imprinting with birds, than another. And this is sometimes described as biological constraints on learning or biological preparedness to learn. So behaviors are more easily learned by one species than another. The next section is all about fear conditioning, and it's described as a type of classical conditioning using a painful, unconditioned stimulus. So, just reiterating, fear conditioning is a type of classical conditioning in which a previously neutral stimulus is repeatedly paired with a painful stimulus until the subject shows fearful responses to that original stimulus. So Pavlov showed that if a stimulus was followed by an electric shock, the animals that were previously indifferent to a particular stimulus would now show signs of fear. Most of these experiments today are done with rats, where the electrical shock is delivered to the floor of the cage, and rats tense up when the shock is applied, and which may help reduce the discomfort or may simply be natural reaction to sudden pain. Another type of fear response that is common is freezing, especially among prey. And these type of fear conditioning experiments could be as simple as a tone that is presented to a rat. So the tone that initially elicited only a slight reaction is repeatedly followed by electrical shock, which elicits the freezing posture and increased heart rate and blood pressure. And then eventually the rat will respond to the tone alone because it is coupling the sound with the shock. And fear conditioning is the type of classical conditioning that was ministered to little Albert, who is talked about at the beginning of the chapter. And he was presented with a sudden, intense noise in the presence of a furry rat, which then Albert came to fear. And he showed stimulus generalization because he wasn't specifically afraid of just a furry rat, but any number of furry animals or objects. And Watson suggested that experience such as little Albert could lead to a phobia, which is described as a marked, long-lasting fear of an object or situation that is out of proportion to the real danger. There is more discussion about phobias later on in the book, but it is not a fear of truly dangerous objects. In the book, examples are like a loaded gun or a sudden drop off a cliff or a wild animal. Many people who report having phobias of one sort or another report that the experience is one of feeling afraid despite knowing intellectually that the fear is an overreaction or even irrational. So the next section we go into is reinforcing behavior. And we first get into Live and Learn, Thorndike's Law of Effect. So Edward Thorndike is most commonly known for his puzzle boxes. So he studied cats and dogs, in which he placed a hungry animal inside a puzzle box. So the puzzle box was simply a cage equipped with levers and latches that the animal must open a door to escape. So he would place a hungry animal inside the box, and to encourage the animal to try to escape, Thorndike would place attractive food just outside the box. He would then measure how long it took for the cat or the dog to get out of the puzzle box. So Thorndike assumed that the animals would not be able to simply look at the levers, the pulleys, and reason how to open the door. But instead, the first time an animal was placed inside a puzzle box, it became very active, but its behavior seemed random, not directed at any particular part of the box. Therefore, the first time an animal was placed inside the box, it might take a while for them to escape. But after escaping from the box the first time, Thorndike wondered what would happen subsequent times. If the animal had actually figured out how the puzzle box worked, then we would expect it to go straight to the correct latch and quickly solve the puzzle. And we would be able to visibly tell that this animal had made an insight or had figured out how to work the puzzle box, because each trial would get faster and faster. So Thorndike noticed that the process seemed very gradual and sometimes hit or miss. In other words, there is no evidence that the animal ever gained a quote-unquote insight from the puzzle box. It might just be able to open the door quickly in one trial versus another. And so Thorndike concluded that the animals solved the puzzle boxes by trial and error and moving in a random fashion until the door opened. This meant that the learning process, rather than being sudden and insightful, was gradual And with each trial, the animal seemed to learn just a little bit more. And so for Thorndike, he proposed that the animal was learning to connect a particular response with the pleasant outcome of the door opening. And to explain this type of learning, Thorndike proposed the law of effect, which is the notion that any behavior that results in a satisfactory outcome is more likely to occur in the future. And this later transitioned into into his idea of what the brain was like. So he called it the black box perspective, as if the brain were simply a black box that we can study without ever opening it up. And this leads into the psychology school of behaviorism. So the perspective that psychologists should study only observable behavior and not its subjective mental events, that we should look at actual behaviors happening to indicate how our brain works, not thinking about lofty mental events. So the next section is called Everyone Likes to Be Rewarded, and this is all about B.F. Skinner in operant conditioning or instrumental learning. So this is a form of associative learning in which the likelihood that an act will be performed depends on the consequences that follow it. And most famously are the operant conditioning chambers. So these are often called Skinner boxes because of B.F. Skinner, and he preferred to call it operant conditioning chambers, but his name has been attached to it. And it's basically a cage in which animals can learn to do a simple task, such as press a bar to obtain a reward. So the classic Skinner box is where a rat is placed in the box, and it learns to associate a particular behavior, such as pressing a bar, with the delivery of food. So the delivery of food makes the animal more likely to press the bar in the future, reinforcing the particular behavior. So Skinner would call the food a reinforcer, which is a stimulus that appears in response to behavior and increases the probability of that behavior reoccurring. So if you want to look at this in experimental form, psychologists often use the idea of shaping. So the example they give is in a way to shape human behavior. So in an experiment, the subjects were told not what they should do, but they were told that they would earn points for their behavior. So their end goal is they want the person to raise their hand. And at first, participants were given rewards for raising their thumb, then moving their hand, until they could earn points when they raised their hand. Only about half the participants could describe what they were doing to earn points. So, more broadly, shaping is a process by which a subject is readily provided with a reinforcer whenever the subject comes close to showing the desired behavior, and then is required to come closer and closer to that desired behavior before receiving the reinforcer. And this is to try and lead a subject to a desired behavior. And another way of this showing, and another insight that Skinner made about human learning, is that if he provided an animal at random food not correlated to any behavior, he noticed some of the animals act as though that their behavior mattered. So they might do kooky things, and this is described as superstition, so the false belief that a particular behavior will bring about a stimulus or event. And this is seen in both humans and animals. They may repeat a behavior thinking it will bring a stimulus. And real quickly, talking about reinforcement and punishment, Positive reinforcement is the addition of a stimulus following a behavior, increasing the likelihood of that behavior, and negative reinforcement is the removal of a stimulus following a behavior,